It is time for us to begin our study this morning. We're thankful for your presence here, and we want you to join us in our conversation. Excuse me. We're going to be in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 20, in verses 1 through 19 is our plan for the day, and hopefully we'll be able to make some good headway into the text and find some kernels of valuable spiritual information for us today. Before we get into our study, though, if you would bow with me in prayer, and we'll use that to start our time together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the blessing that it is to have your word, to gather safely, to dig into the scriptures, to consider the message that you have left for us in ways that will enrich our faith, challenge our worldly ways, and help us to become more like your Son. Help us to be dutiful and detailed readers of the message with a willingness to apply it in our lives. This is our prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so as mentioned, we are in the text of chapter 20. We're looking at verses 1 through 19 in a moment. Just a quick reminder of where we have come from and where we're going. Remember, this comes on the literal heels of the arrival of Jesus and all that visually would entail in his entrance into Jerusalem. We have the Luke account here. There's other accounts of that same event in the gospel messages. Each of them I tend to look like as different camera angles on the same event, where one is kind of focused on one detail and another camera angle is focused on another aspect of it from how they describe the events. But then also the biblical writers will take those different details and emphasize the various components of those things in different ways. I want to make a point about this that I think is really interesting. This is something we all struggle to do well. If I were to ask you right now to draw a smiley face, I suspect that most of us would draw a circle and then a couple of dots and then kind of a half moon for a smiley face, right? I think most of us was, that's a smiley face, because we've established in our cognitive basis that a smiley face looks like that. Now, some of our circles wouldn't be the same, right? Some of us struggle with the concept of drawing a proper circle. Some of our dots for the eyes and the nose will be a little off center. And our smiley faces would vary in shape, right? Some are a little shallower, some have the big sharp edges, all of that. But if I asked you on a second level to draw for us a three-dimensional face, how many of you believe that you could produce a face that a third person, not in this room, could come back and say, this is that person? I've got nothing there. I can draw all right. I can do landscapes and some stuff, and I can sketch, and I can work with digital art pretty well, and eventually I can make a face. But to do a face that actually looks like somebody else, that's recognizable, a lot of difficulty, right? I think we all understand that that's a challenging aspect. No matter what medium we're working in, whether it's drawing, whether it's clays, whether it's stone, there's a challenge there to accomplish that. Intellectually, we actually do the same thing. We can develop a two-dimensional rendering of an idea, a concept, a principle, pretty easily and become pretty consistent about it, that this should be kind of that. But when we try to develop an idea that is multifaceted or multidimensional, we struggle to create it in a way that others can see and describe, to communicate that idea. We do that with biblical ideas a lot. We can create the surface two-dimensional view of it. We try to share the intricacies of the details behind it. We struggle. Here's the illustration. When I ask you to describe for me, using words, the Christ in a concise way, how hard is that to describe the anointed of God in a concise, consistent way? We think it's not hard, right? That's Jesus, right? List out all of his titles off the top of your head. All the title natures of Jesus you can think of right now. How many you got? There's no definitive list I've got in my head, so your answer is going to be right no matter what number you come up with, because we're kind of cobbling it together intentionally right now. Bobby, what you got?
When I think of it as a man with a glow around his head.
Right, so we think about him in the Transfiguration, where he revealed a bit of his godly divinity to the audience around him. How about this? Prophet, priest, king, counselor. What else? You got a list in your notes, don't you? You pulled out a list. What's your list? You got it? We're going to use it.
Bread of life, chief shepherd, cornerstone, Emmanuel, gift of God, heir of all, high priest, Lamb of God, King of kings, King of all the earth, Lord of heaven, Lord of glory, Messiah, and it goes on.
Yeah, long list, right? One title is a two-dimensional view of Jesus. All the titles become three-dimensional in that you're fleshing out the idea. And if Doc was here, he would say, Marty, you're not thinking in the fourth dimension. And if you got that reference, you know what movie I'm talking about. But there actually is the spiritual aspect of Jesus, God, that is really hard for us to quantify because we're not a heavenly being. So there is, I guess maybe metaphorically speaking, a fourth dimension to Jesus. We can only think of him in earthly terms. It's two-dimensional, three-dimensional. But you notice how that one title aspect of it, I can describe that. When you try to put all those pieces as to who Jesus is together, the three-dimensional aspect of him, we're going to think about that in different ways because the things that are immediately more important to us or personally more experiential to us become easier to kind of hug onto and capture. And the ones that seem harder to conceptualize, we don't know what to do with them. So we know it's part of the picture, but we can't draw it. We can't identify it. We can't communicate it well. All of that sums up two ideas that help us understand this text. Idea number one, gospel accounts render the different camera angles that highlight these different attributes that are a mix of two-dimensional, three-dimensional viewing of Jesus. Point number one. Point number two, the audience that's seeing all of this happen, they have all our same struggles. When they see Jesus, some of them saw their family member who they're not quite sure what to do with. Some of them saw a rabbi who seems to have good answers to tough questions. Some of them saw the Son of God, but didn't truly understand what that meant. Some of them saw trouble. And we're going to see that trouble side expose itself here in a second when we start paying attention to our narrow text. Anything I missed in that? I know there's probably a lot of space in that three-dimensional, fourth-dimensional space.
Some of them saw him as the son of a carpenter.
Yeah. You're just some
Different idea.
wild-eyed son of a carpenter who's got some strange ideas. We want nothing to do with you. Who are you? You're just Joseph's son. Like all of that whole spectrum of how they see him, again, informs or teaches us how we see Jesus, or we obscure the risen Savior from our view because we're not ready to deal with that part of whom he is. You think about it one more step. How many people have described Jesus as all-loving, but forgot that he is also all-powerful? And those two things emotionally seem at odds with one another based on our situation. When we want him to be all-powerful, or when we want him to be all-loving, and we forget that he's both in the sense of being God. All right, so in this section here, which is our kind of focused space here, this text presents this Jesus who is all the things we know, but only a narrow scope of ideas to the audience at hand, will come to him, and this is going to be a question of, prove to us this reality that you're expressing. what are your credentials? What are your qualifications, your qualifiers to make this kind of a scene? Like, who do you think you are is another way to consider it. And so let's just read two parts of this in sequence. And so we're going to start with verses 1 through 8 as a reading right now. Bobby, you want to read that for us, if you would? Chapter 20, verses 1 through 8.
Okay. And it came to pass that on one of those days, as he taught the people in the temple and preached the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes came upon him with the elders and spake unto him, saying, Tell us by what authority thou doest these things. Who is he that gave you this authority? And he answered and said unto them, I will also ask you one thing, and answer me. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or of men? And they reasoned with themselves, saying, If we shall say from heaven, he will say, Why then believe ye him not? But, and if we say of men, all people will stone us, for they be persuaded that John was a prophet. And they answered, they could not tell whence it was. And Jesus said unto them, Neither tell I you by what authority I do these things. Then began he to speak to the people.
We'll just pause right there at verse 8. And we'll come into verse 9 in a moment, Bobby. So this interaction between Jesus engages a couple of our process of thinking. Was this a question they had asked John the Baptist in the Bible text? In the biblical text, did they ask John, how do you authorize your behavior? Is there a record of that interaction taking place from the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Not that I can recall directly and distinctly, or they actually asked him this kind of question, but how was John treated because of what he said? Separate question. They treated him as a prophet, except some people really didn't like what he was saying, right? The consequence for John's preaching cost him his life, but not his convictions. He was willing to give up his life to maintain the authenticity of his message. And his message pointed to someone greater than he. So his message said, I'm here to advance the cause of God. There's someone to pay attention to in the future. Look for him. And then there's all the kind of statutory events that take place that say, here he is, here he is, here he is, boom, there he is. So you got all of that narrative there. But Jesus, in this way of interaction, sets up a second layer conflict. The first layer is between he and they. Hey, who gave you this authority? Who said you could do this? They're implying that they have the right to make that determination. But the second layer is the reason that John got tolerated and the reason that early Jesus was tolerated was because these leaders feared whom? They feared the people. And Jesus' question here puts them all in this basket of saying, wait a minute, if we reject this guy's activity, the people aren't going to be happy because we know what they thought about John. We just saw what they thought about him. And they have a limited level of authority. They are not kings in Jerusalem who can just do whatever they want. Who are they accountable to? Who is this ruling party of elders, Sadducees, leaders in the spiritual bubble, if you will, of Israel? Who did they have to get permission from?
God.
Well, God spiritually, Rome physically, and now they're in this little vice space because they want to keep their physical power, right? So both those answers are important to what we're trying to figure out, like what's going on. Where do they go to make their steps, though? Do they go to the temple and pray to God and ask for guidance? No biblical record of that taking place at this point. Is it possible? Sure, anything's possible. Is it plausible? No. Because we see their behavior goes a different direction. So Jesus' interaction here in this serious confrontation with those who are ruling in Jerusalem on a practical level, the lives of people there, he basically says, my authority, same as John's. And then he makes kind of a counter conciliation, like they wouldn't answer the question. He's like, because they know they've asked a question that has put them in a place that if they answer it, they don't want to deal with the consequences of it. Politically today, if we're in a political conversation, this is an event that sounds like no comment. We'll take no further questions on that matter and leave the room. Like that's what they're doing because they don't want to expose what would be their actual views. Now it's interesting, Jesus does something here that's similar to his earlier interactions with them. He says that I'm not going to answer your question. Do you feel like that's an answer that you would be satisfied with if somebody came in a dialogue and said, well, if you're not going to answer my question, I'm not going to answer yours? How'd you feel about that? Personally, without thinking about Jesus being Jesus and all of that. Like, what? Why would you answer my question? It feels on the surface schoolyardy, right? Kind of kindergarten level behavior. No offense to kindergartners. They probably make better choices sometimes than the adults do. But it feels that way. Kind of petty. Except for two realities. Reality number one is this is a public conversation where Jesus' goal isn't to answer their question. Jesus' goal is to expose their hypocrisy. And by his answer, he exposes their hypocrisy. Secondly, unlike us, Jesus has a clearer insight into the motives of his questioners. I will say, though, that there's nothing condemning not answering a question. We're trained that we have to answer the questions that are asked of us. You know, not answering is a biblical response to questions that you feel like if you answer them, you're going to put yourself in between God and man in ways you're not comfortable with. You can always just keep silent. There's consequences for that too, right? And Jesus chooses to keep silent in other places as well. Later in these trials, if you will, these kind of not so much full scope trials, but eventually they become the equivalent of legal interaction in their culture and context. So the story continues, and Jesus, in essence, answers the question in a different way in the next part of the text. And that's really interesting. He doesn't directly answer the questions, but he teaches a parable-style instruction that tells everybody what he thinks, what he considers and knows about this group. Michael, do you want to read that for us? Verses 9 through 20 of chapter 20. Excuse me, 9 through 19, not 20.
And he began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey for a long time. At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers so they would give him some of the produce of the vineyard. But the vine growers beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he proceeded to send another slave, and they beat him also. And they treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he proceeded to send the third, and this one they wounded and cast out. The owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the vine growers saw him, they reasoned with one another, saying, "This is the heir. Let's kill him so the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. what then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy the vine growers and will give the vineyard to the others. When they heard it, they said, may it never be. But Jesus looked at them and said, what then is this that is written? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken into pieces, but in whomever it falls, it will be scattered. It will scatter him like dust. The scribes and the chief priests tried to lay hands on him at that very hour. And they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke this parable against them.
So, the intended audience of this parable, unlike many of the other parables, seems to get part of this message, right? Like these guys figure out the part that says, you're the trouble. But let's back up for a second and pay attention to the bigger picture of what Jesus is teaching here in the parable format, if you will. It's not just like some of the other parables we've read. There's a little bit more theological content going on. It's not purely kingdom focused like a lot of the parables are. So there's some important things to think about. Foremost here is to pay attention to the Old Testament. So this parable really kind of finds its space, like Mark and Matthew connect for us, in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. This is a well-known section of the prophet Isaiah's teaching that makes this similar call about God's interaction with the people of Israel. And the imagery of Israel being God's vineyard is really kind of rich in that chapter. So when you think about what's going on here, this is a known idea that everybody knows, if they're familiar with the prophets speaking and writing, that this story is talking about Israel. Like for some of us, we have to kind of think a couple steps to get there. Maybe we are not familiar with the Old Testament. Maybe we're growing our faith. Maybe these things are a little less familiar to us. But to the audience, this is like super-de-duper obvious. For us today, you could think about anything that would be really closely linked together, such as, in Georgia, is there a particular fruit that Georgia is known for? Peaches, right? So if there was a story that highlighted peaches in a negative way written by a state near us, like let's say Alabama decided to wage verbal war with Georgia and start attacking the quality of our peaches, but not mention Georgia, just say peaches all the time, how would the Georgia populace respond to that if it started showing up in the news all the time? Well, that was fight words. Our peaches are better, right? We would know that they're talking about us when they're talking about peaches because it would be obvious. And you can pick any kind of icon that's uniquely connected to a community that you're familiar with. And if it gets started talking about, then you know, right? You kind of know. In this case, take that little illustration I made of peaches in Georgia and times it by 10. The imagery of the vineyard for the people of Israel is super specific, super unified into their ideas. Here's a quick thinking about it. When they came back from the promised land and the spies were returning, what do they come carrying back with them? Grapes and vines. And what the biblical text describes it in a pretty astounding terminology, where we even struggle to translate the phrases because the imagery is so hyperbolic, so big. Do you remember how big those grapes are supposed to be? They're just unquantifiable. Literally, if we translate it on a literal level, those grapes don't make sense. Because you know that grapes can get so big that they pop their skins. They can get so huge that they've grown too big. But the way that those are pictured is the vine is so heavy and so well populated that it's being carried on a pole. Like they have to stretch it between people. It's so massive and mammoth that it becomes significant that their kings are now identified not only as shepherds, but vine growers. And those two images become the standards of king identification in Israel. Whereas in Egypt before, it was farmers who were wheat associated. And you can see those images and all of those regal lines. And so saying this vineyard imagery immediately pushes the arc, like the whole arc of this story. We're talking about Israel, and you've just claimed authority. You've said, who gives you the right, the authority to speak here? I challenged you back. You wouldn't answer my question. So when he starts talking about wicked tenants, wicked laborers in the vineyard, and particularly verse 16, what their outcome is going to be. People are going to put that in more specific terminology. They could have said, are you threatening me? Are you saying you're going to kill me? Because look at their response. Again, verse 19 of the text, it reads, the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them. But they feared the people. He threatened them with what punishment inside the text? Verse 16, what does it say? They're going to get killed. So the space of the emotional existence of this argument that's going on in here, like what's going on, has gone from common conversation, oh, you're here, good to see you, to, what do you think you're doing? To, one of us is going to die soon. Because Jesus has verbally indicated that their demise as poor leaders for Israel should equate to their death. What's in the mind of the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees at this point in regards to Jesus? What is their mindset towards him? They're going to shut him up by any means necessary, even to the point where a prophetic statement is going to be made that is counter what you would think that guy would be saying. It's good that one would die. So they're willing to go to that extent because of their convictions. Clearly we know where Jesus is in the space as well. So then we got to start thinking about this on a standpoint of who else is indicated in the text. So we know that the beloved Son is identified. Who is represented in the middle space? Who else has been poorly treated by the wicked tenants? Application space, prophets. So here's a biblical tie-in. Nearly all the prophets die in disgrace, some way or another. I say nearly all is that we don't know the history of every single participant in the sons of the prophets or the schools of the prophets. But to some degree or another, they are rejected heavily by Israel. Some are killed in the course of their labors. Some are held captive. But the reason I say that is because what does the text of Revelation teach concerning the blood of the prophets? If you remember in the text of Revelation, there's a phrase there. The blood of the prophets cries out. And in that context, it's crying out, not rejoicing for the arrival of the Son, which is underlying all of those truths, but cries out in judgment to the people of Jerusalem, metaphorically and then realistically to the prior generations in context of their history. Because Israel has a habit, an engaged historical reality of rejecting its prophets. So that's that biblical story. Now we go to us, because we have to get to the application space of thinking it through for our application. Who should we identify with in this text? And can we identify with anybody in this text? We should find our identity in him, right? Is that hard for us to do? Can you place yourself in Jesus' shoes here easily? That's a tough place to be in, right? Because he's not wanted where he's at. He's engaging in combative theological discussion with people who have great power over everybody he cares about. And he may not care about his own physical flesh because there's more going on there than we can kind of capture. But if we step into that space, and we do at times, by the way, we'll get there in a second, it's a different experience for us in some ways. You ever have a rough conversation with a family member about spiritual things? Where you're absolutely concerned for their well-being, and their response is, "Who do you think you are? What gives you the right to tell me what to do?" Like I'm the little cousin and the little brother. So if you put that space right there, what do you think all my cousins, my first cousins, and my brothers think about my message when I preach? Like, it's not a hard space to get into, right? They're not happy about it sometimes. Even if they agree with me, and I'll tell you, at least my brothers, they absolutely don't. Some of my cousins, different space. But I'm still a little cousin, right? And who do I think I am? That's the space that Jesus is in. And I think many of you are like, I kind of know that a little bit. I think I've been there. Bobby, did you have something?
Well, if you start trying to talk to kin people about the gospel, they'll belittle you in order to shut you up. They say ever since you've been with those people, you've been acting different.
Yeah, I got emails and letters from family members that sound just like that. They'll literally go down that same phrasing, all those same concerns. You change the issue, though, and if they somehow agree with me, I'm the expert all of a sudden. Our bias predicts our behavior more than we know. Now, that's also important because you know who else is biased? We are. Like, I'm biased. I can tell you things 100% certainty that you will not sway my opinion on whatsoever. Now, I hope, like most of you, we recognize those biases should exist in realms that don't have theological consequences. Right? Michael and Les were just having a conversation with Linda when we came in for Bible study this morning about their favorite places. You know, and whether that's the mountains or the beach. You know what? It's totally fine for each of them to have different opinions on that matter. It's absolutely great. I'm not sure that they would be persuaded to shift their opinions at this point. It's also fine too. But that's an illustration of a pre-existing bias. We all have them. And we actually learn to be critical analyzers of them as we get to be better Bible students. Because we ask the question, is this really relevant to what I need to know spiritually? Or am I holding and clinging to something that I need to let go? They were holding and clinging to the idea that they were in charge. And to a certain degree, they actually had a right to be levels of leaders in Israel if they had the proper lineage and the proper relationship to God. And we're going to assume that they did, in the sense of lineage. So we go back to this again. We start thinking through. We have the prophets. They didn't listen to them. We've got Jesus who's being ignored. And we've got us who are trying to step into this text in a way that helps us mature our faith. Application point 1 to recognize is that sometimes the pressure will be so intense we're not going to know exactly what to do, but we still have to keep walking forward. If you want a literary or a modern illustration of this, if you've ever read the book or the film entitled A Time to Kill, which is a really interesting legal drama that deals with racial tension in the South. That deals with a lot of these same kind of pressures to be the outlier who says the thing that no one expects but needs to be said, and to develop the confidence to do that. We do that in our faith, right? Because let's add another thing. Think back to the first difficult conversation you had with a kinfolk, a relation, about spiritual things, compared to one after you had a little bit more experience and maturity. Did you change your approach in an attempt to do a better job the second time?
Yes.
Absolutely. I can tell you about my first conversation with my brother David about spiritual matters ended with both of us yelling and crying at the same time. About all kinds of stuff. Was that effective for either of us? Not really. Whose fault was it? Us. Like, I feel like I have more responsibility because I was trying to help, but in the end it was us. Because he has a part in it too. It's always us, but responsibility kind of brings into play. The next conversation was a little bit better. You know the outcome of that one? Nobody yelled, but somebody still cried. So things changed a little bit. And I'll just tell you, my brother wasn't crying. So you think about each of these steps of us understanding what Jesus is doing here. We are doing the same things as we develop ourselves in this simple, narrow space of declaring our convictions, but dealing with the conflict. These are all dialogues we have at different levels. And they're going to be different based on where we are in our space as believers, like what we know and what we don't know. None of them are easy. This challenging counter-challenge section of the text here has practical implications when we think about the theology of it. Because those who reject Jesus broadly and generically, now we're moving not from narrow theological discussions, but absolute rejection of Jesus. There's big consequences for that, right? Those are different than the ones that are also equally significant than on the theological doctrinal space, like this issue, where you're kind of wrangling through the ideas of it and trying to figure out how to handle it, rather than an abject or a complete rejection of Christ as the Messiah. All right, so we got like 7 minutes this time. I'm getting better to getting my big information in so we can get back to having our questions. Specifically, in this section, what did you like? What do you like about this part of the biblical story? There's stuff to like in here, at least I think I've had some pretty cool stuff. But Rich?
So I like the statements you've talked about. This was a difficult conversation, and it started out as a challenge. And I like this verse where it says, verse 17, but he looked them directly in the eye. He looked at them directly and made these statements. And some might say that Jesus spoke in parables and it was super confusing, but these guys knew exactly what he said. And I think that's important as well. He made his point, he looked him directly in the eye, and told it.
Yeah, Jesus' messages are obscured to those he doesn't want to know what he's saying. That's the application context. He obscures it, if necessary, to narrow the audience, so that only those who are the intended audience get the full meaning. And then we also get the chance to read back into the text, because we're seeing things a lot more clearly with everything that the disciples remembered before they wrote and compiled those narratives in the Gospels, and then the latter bits and pieces that come through the book of Acts and the epistles. So that laser focus of he looked at them and it says directly at them, that's part of communication, right? Body language, those nonverbals that shift generationally, but some things don't shift. Like if all of a sudden the speaker's looking at somebody and then they narrow in on them, and then they shift their gaze right at a person, like everyone knows. Like he was talking about you. Even their mama knows he was talking about you, and mama wasn't even there. What else? What else struck you as important? Or you can also say, what didn't you like as a counterpoint if you want to. Michael?
Thinking about what you said, what didn't you like? The response both times, sometimes evil is just going to be evil. The first time, You know, they just didn't answer because they knew they couldn't answer, not create a problem for themselves. And the second time, you know, they sought to lay hands on him. And what I didn't like about it, that seemed to jump out both those stories to me. Sometimes evil was just going to be evil.
Right, and I thought about it this way in the same area. They're not acting because of the people, so they go underground to do their activities. They catch him at night. It's this quiet secret trial. It's all this stuff done under the cover of darkness. What happened to the people? What swayed the people so significant when they saw him as a criminal all of a sudden? That's different from me. If I got introduced to someone who I thought was a pretty good guy, but all of a sudden they've been arrested on charges, and the governing authority says this guy did it, what makes me different from them? Does our perception of someone include that? Because how often in the news do you see someone arrested and all of a sudden you liked them, but now you're not quite so sure? Because isn't that all the people who were protecting him by their presence before are the same ones who say what when he is brought forth as a criminal? He's clearly one to blame. Crucify him. We're not different than that audience as much as we want to think we are at times. Because of the put up in charges. There must have been good evidence for that to happen. And even if they're clear to the charges, do we think about them as less? They must have done something. They did something to get there. Well, did Jesus do anything? Because if the standard is they must have done something, how many of us should be tried as criminals if they must have done something? Yeah, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but how many of you stole candy when you were a kid out of a grocery store? I was like, no, please don't make me raise my hands. Because how many times were you brought back afterwards by your mom or daddy to hand that candy back and straighten the business out? All right? Because we understand that reality on the small scale, we should see it on the big scale too. These teach us a lot about the full nature of Jesus as God. These little small stories like this. Because here's the thing. When he's looking directly at him, remember who it is who looks directly at them. John 1:1, John 1:11, or 1 in verses 11 through 14. The Word made flesh. There are some individuals, you probably met them, that have the ability to just create this look that makes you wilt. Like, I can't speak, because they've got that piercing gaze. I kind of imagine this is at that kind of moment, where a little bit of the concept of the transfiguration of God is being identified in the kind of boldness that's here. But not so much the divine aspect of it, but the confidence of conviction. And it's another thing that you and I can develop to become more like him. That level of moral and spiritual confidence. All right, that's it for our time this morning. I want to thank everyone for their participation in class. We'll be continuing in the Gospel of Luke next Sunday morning. Thanks, everybody.